shifting gears, Congressman, I'll let Brandon come here and ask you a question next. Let's talk about the big event right here. Was the meeting with Putin, Zelensky, excuse me, President Trump and Zelensky, Vance, was that a success or failure, or how should we rate it?
Well, if you're Putin, it was an outstanding success. If you're supporting Russia and its aggression, or North Korea and its aggression, keeping in mind that North Korea is also using troops now against the Ukraine forces, or China, who wants to invade Taiwan. All of these things are great successes for them. And this, what I refer to as the White House media debacle, was a horrific loss for Ukraine President Zelensky, for the Ukrainian people, for Donald Trump, and for the people of America. Anyone associated with the actual event, it was a debacle, so they lost.
Congressman, the president seems to be putting pressure on Zelensky to accept a deal with Putin by cutting off military assistance to Ukraine. Is there a danger? I know the president wants to end this war, but is there a danger that by putting pressure on Zelensky and cutting off those American weapons, which have been such a force multiplier for Ukraine, if they don't have American weapons going forward, that could tilt the balance? Is there a danger that could tilt the balance of power on the battlefield so much in favor of Russia that they don't agree to a deal because they're getting what they want on the ground by conquest?
Look, President Trump is absolutely wrong to help the North Koreans and Russia with their attacks on Ukrainian forces. Absolutely wrong. And this originates out of spite or revenge, in my opinion, dating back to 2019. In 2019, Donald Trump was president, and he demanded that Zelensky and Ukraine publicly announce an investigation of Joe Biden. In my judgment, Donald Trump made that demand in order to help him beat Joe Biden in the 2020 elections. Zelensky responded, I don't want to get involved in America's domestic politics. That would not be a good thing for Ukraine. It's a very perilous course of action you asked me to take, and so I'm going to respectfully decline. And in retaliation, Donald Trump immediately suspended all aid to Ukraine. And that suspension lasted for a considerable period of time. And you're seeing Donald Trump this go around use the same kind of measures. And it's not just the cessation of delivery of military armaments, it's also denying Ukraine the relatively inexpensive intelligence that we have been able to provide Ukraine, so that Ukraine is better prepared for Russia's next attacks within Ukrainian territory. And the reason I say this is all wrong, it's multifaceted. First, the president is asking Ukraine and Zelensky to surrender, okay? It's not about peace. That's just the political lingo, the propaganda that is used to try to make it look better, what Donald Trump is trying to do. He is demanding a partial or complete surrender of Ukraine to Russia. Partial is immediate, giving up land and rewarding Russia for their invasion of Ukraine. And that demand by President Trump and coercion by President Trump is wrong. It's also wrong because it is a betrayal of a country that has been an ally for 3 years now, longer for that matter. And every other American ally around the globe sees how unreliable the word of the United States of America is, and that diminishes our standing in the world, free world opinion. It also suggests to our allies that perhaps when America is attacked, they should not rush to the aid of America, because this betrayal of Ukraine signals to our allies that we are not reliable, and we're not going to rush to their aid if they get attacked. And so if they walk away with an impression that the United States is not reliable, that the United States will not honor its agreements with its allies, then that encourages our allies to treat the United States the same. So it's really bad for our image. It's really bad for our alliances. It is a betrayal, not just in the sense that we've been working with Ukraine for a number of years, but I'm going to digress decades. Back in 1994, there was an agreement. It was signed by Russia. It was signed by Ukraine. It was signed by the United Kingdom, and it was signed by the United States of America. And it helped to establish not only the boundaries between Russia and Ukraine, it also caused Ukraine to give up its best national security weapon, nuclear weapons. Now, the United States rushed in and threw, as we always do, money at the problem. And the pressure from the United States, coupled with the inducement of the money, caused Ukraine to give up its best border security weapon, those nuclear weapons, to transfer them to Ukraine. And Ukraine did so with the understanding that the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom would respect the boundaries that Russia and Ukraine agreed on. Well, the United States has breached that agreement because we did nothing when this invasion began in 2014. We did a little bit in 2018 and 2019 under Trump. Of course, Trump got mad at Zelensky and Ukraine and suspended aid for some period of time. My memory serves me correctly, it's for 55 days. And then when you had yet another invasion, keep in mind, first it was Crimea, then it was two eastern regions of Ukraine, and then 3 years ago, it was the whole country. So all of this is really bad public policy. There is not an instance in history, world history, that I'm aware of, where appeasement to an aggressor nation has caused that aggressor nation to quit being aggressive. But history is replete with examples of where appeasement results in larger wars. Probably the most notable one, most memorable one, being Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, appeasing Nazi Germany not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 or 5 times before the United Kingdom and also France decided that they had to do something to stop Nazi Germany. Otherwise, Nazi Germany was going to overrun Europe and oppose their dictatorial will and everybody else. And unfortunately for the United Kingdom and France, they waited too late. And Nazi Germany was able to overrun mainland Europe. And fortunately for the United Kingdom, with the help of the United States, Nazi Germany was not able to overrun the United Kingdom too.
Is the president allowing our foreign policy to be dictated by our short-term economic policy, i.e., getting the war over with so that we can lift the sanctions on Russia so that they can start, back to exporting their oil, and we can start importing their fertilizer components, which our farmers desperately need?
Well, economics is almost always a factor in every war that's been fought, okay? There are winners and losers economically from these kinds of conflicts, both on a national level and on a corporate level, or on an oligarch level, a wealthy person level, someone who manufactures armaments, by way of examples. So this is not unusual that economics would be a factor, but we need to understand some basic concepts here. We are a free world country. We have other countries around the world that also believe in freedom and are republics. And we tend to form alliances with fellow republics because of the threat of dictatorial governments around the globe. Now, we can call them communists, we can call them a bunch of different things, but they are a threat to freedom and liberty. They're a threat to democracy and our Republican form of government. And we don't want these dictatorial nations such as Iran, such as Communist China, such as North Korea, such as Russia, to be able to spread their dictatorial value system, their brutality on the free world. And unfortunately, what has happened is Donald Trump has forgotten these principles. And Donald Trump is now aiding and abetting a very evil dictator, Putin, in his conquest of Russia. And since North Korea has sent troops into the battlefield in support of Russia, fighting and killing Ukrainians, Donald Trump is also supporting the North Korean effort. And that's got to be troublesome to anyone in America who believes in liberty, who believes in freedom, who believes in democracies and our Republican form of government. It's certainly concerning to me. And the long-term message is this: if we continue to betray Ukraine, as Donald Trump is betraying Ukraine, if we continue to betray our allies in Europe, then that is a sign of weakness to Russia, to North Korea, to Communist China, and it is an encouragement to each of them to be aggressive while you've got a weak president holding office in America's White House. That's the message. That's the way they're going to interpret it. If we surrender, or we encourage Ukraine to surrender in whole or in part, and that's exactly what Donald Trump is doing. It's bad policy.
If we retreat into an American first, it's us for us, we're not worried about the rest of the world, foreign policy, should Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, maybe Poland, should they begin building nuclear weapons so they have their own deterrent if they can't rely on the United States?
Well, if I were them, yes, because I would want nuclear weapons so that the mutually assured destruction doctrine protects each and every one of them from invasion. For those who are listening to this show or watching this show, the mutually assured destruction doctrine is real simple. You dare not attack me, because if you do, I will unleash my nuclear arsenal on you, and it will be mutual suicide. Assuming you don't want to die, you won't attack me. And the mutually assured destruction doctrine has worked ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Russia's obtaining nuclear weapons later in the 1940s. And I would expect that there would be a widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons. And quite frankly, looking back on it, it was a major mistake in 1994 for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons and rely on the word of Russia not to attack, and rely on the United Kingdom and the United States to help Ukraine respect the borders that were agreed to in this document and in other documents.
Congressman, with this war being so brutal since we've seen since the Eastern Front of World War II, Ukraine seems to be running out of men. Where do they replenish this manpower at?
Well, actually, they're not running out of men. They've had, if you believe the Ukrainian government, and I would take their word with a grain of salt, but they've had 45,000 deaths as of earlier this year in a nation that is tens of millions of people. They might be running out of volunteers. They might have to go to a draft, but you know, that's not unusual. The United States has had to do a draft for Vietnam, for Korea, for World War II, for World War I, for the Civil War. So that's not unusual. In terms of casualty rates, the Russians are suffering much higher casualties than the Ukrainians, to the point where Russia has run out of prisoners to send to get killed and slaughtered on the front lines, and has had to rely on an ally, North Korea, to supplement its military forces. To me, we hate to see these casualties, don't get me wrong, but Ukraine has the manpower. The only issue is whether the free world is going to stop Russia here by supplying the kind of weaponry that overwhelms the Russian forces. And we have that capability, even though Ukraine might have fewer soldiers on the battlefield, their kill capability will vastly exceed that of Russian forces if we share with Ukraine the weaponry that is needed. But if we don't do that, then you might see American forces having to defend in the Balkans, the Baltics, the Poland, Sweden, Finland, or Norway, whatever the next target of Russia may be. And that's assuming that China doesn't see this as a great opportunity to finally attack Taiwan.
Marksman, with our budget now, I think 1.5% of it going to pay for this war is, and as much as we are in debt, is that going to start putting a strain on us?
Well, 1.5% is 1.5%, and every little bit helps. But to put it into perspective, our deficit is about 1.8, $1.9 trillion. Last year's approximately 1.8. This year it's projected to be 1.9 to 2 trillion. But we're 5 months into it, 7 months to go. You've got Doge out there trying to cut spending. So hopefully we'll be better off than Biden's last fiscal year. But the amount of money we're spending to assist a fellow republic is less than 5% of the annual deficits that we're racking up, or roughly 5%. It might be a little bit more, a little bit less, somewhere in that ballpark. So while 5% of the overall deficit is still significant at 5%, it's not going to make a difference in whether we go belly up as a country because of the accumulated debt that's now $36 trillion. Also bear in mind that we're spending roughly $1 trillion on servicing our debt, which is more than triple what we were spending just a short 3 or 4 years ago. So you have to bear in mind the debt, and you have to look at it long term. If Russia defeats Ukraine, if President Trump is successful in forcing Ukraine to surrender in whole or in part, is there going to be a bigger war in our future? That's what you have to look at. We don't like the cost that we're incurring, but will there be a larger cost if we don't incur these costs now? And will those larger costs in the future also include a loss of American lives on the battlefield, which is a major risk? You know, we were drawn into World War II. We were drawn into World War I. In a way, we were drawn into Korea and Vietnam, not as significantly as World War I and as obviously as World War I and World War II, but still, there are cascading effects. And the historical lesson ought to be that if you can nip these things in the bud, stop the aggressor early on, when they have less manpower and they have less resources, then in the long haul, you're saving yourself a lot of money and you're saving a lot of American lives.
We've talked about, there possibly being a peace dividend of us not having to pay for Ukraine's aid if this war ends. How much of that would be negated? Because if, we cede basically, 20% of Ukraine to Russia permanently in a peace deal, that would allow Putin, who has militarized his economy, much like Germany did in World War II, he can redeploy his forces, against the Baltic states or against Poland. So even if there's no war, we may have to go to a Cold War footing like we were in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where there were, U.S. forces deployed in Europe permanently at, multiple division strength, afraid that Putin will cross the border because, he's invaded Ukraine twice and he's had other military adventures. While he's in power, there's no reason to believe that when this war is over, that Putin's wars are over.
Well, you're spot on with that analysis. And let me emphasize something, and this is also in accord with what happened with Nazi Germany in the 1930s and up until the period of time in which the United States became involved with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Each time an aggressor nation conquers surrounding land, they have more natural resources for their war machine, and they have a pool of conscripts that they can make fight in their wars against other nations. So what happens is the threat becomes greater because the threat becomes more powerful. With Nazi Germany, you had them taking over Austria. All of a sudden, boy, that's a whole lot of manpower they have at their disposal, a lot of resources. You have them taking over Czechoslovakia. That's, again, a bunch of resources and a bunch of people. And if Russia acquires all or part of Ukraine, what they're next going to do is, in my judgment at least, is test the will of the free world by picking off some of the Balkan or Baltic nations that are relatively small. And each time they gobble up another piece, they have strengthened themselves for the next fight. And ultimately, it becomes much, much more costly monetarily and with the loss of life to stop the aggression. So that's what I mean when I say you got to nip it in the bud. Right now, you've got Ukrainians who are dying, not Americans. Ukrainians are dying in the name of liberty and freedom and independence for their nation. All they are asking for is for the free world to help supply them with the weaponry so that they can make Russia pay and bleed them dry and ultimately force Russia out of Ukraine. In my judgment, if the free world would adequately arm Ukraine, they would beat Russia hands down. One thing that this Ukraine war has shown is that Russia does not have the kind of military capability that they once had. Their weaponry is not on a par with that of the United States of America. Russia, by way of example, has relied heavily on tanks. Well, nowadays, tanks basically are a place where you go if you want to get exploded, because the tanks are taken out pretty quickly with the modern day weaponry that we have, the anti-tank weapons such as Javelin, just being one example, that is very, very effective at turning each of those tanks into very hot coffins for 4, 5, 6 Russian soldiers that are within. So it's just a matter of us supplying the weaponry along with the free world. Now, I will mention there is one really good thing about Donald Trump betraying our ally Ukraine, and to a lesser degree, betraying our NATO partners. It has scared our NATO partners to death, and they are being forced to carry more of the load for the defense of Europe. That might have been an intended goal by President Trump or an unintended goal of President Trump. Regardless, it's one of the things that is happening. And to the extent Western Europe becomes more militarily strong or stronger, then they make better allies for the United States of America. And collectively, all of us become a more potent weapon because of the growth and strength emanating from Europe.
So, Congressman, do you think with the proper military aid, they could push Russia back?
Oh, absolutely. Our weaponry is so vastly superior to what the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans are able to field. No question. If we were all in, Russia would get pummeled and they would be forced all the way back to their original borders. And that would be a very strong lesson to the aggressors around the world that you better not mess with us, because if you do, you're going to lose. And ultimately, the long-term goal ought to be the removal of Putin as the dictator in charge of Russia. And if Russia were to lose in Ukraine, then there is an increasing chance that the Russian people would take back control of their government and evict Putin as their leader using whatever means are at their disposal.